Hello?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I can. How you doing?
And how are you, sir?
I'd say I'm doing at least a little bit pog, altogether. Please introduce yourself, name, pronouns, height, weight, hair color. Give them the whole rundown, would you?
Sure. So I'm Cicero Foster, which is an absolutely real name. Online, I go by New American Left. Twitter.com/New Left Press, and then YouTube. If you just search New American Left, you can find me. I'm 6'3", blue eyes.
Convincing.
I think blonde hair. I'm not really sure anymore. It's kind of gotten dirty, but there you go.
Sort of an Aryan super soldier vibe going on then.
I mean, you said that, not me. So I don't want to get in trouble with the Twitter people. But,
of course. Didn't you went by a different name up until recently, right?
Yeah, I used to be under a different name, and then I sort of rebranded because I actually used to be a conservative, and I wasn't thrilled with the sort of political takes I had back then. So I decided to it was just sort of easier to distinguish my views now from my views back then by adopting sort of a new identity, if that makes sense.
No, I completely understand. So yeah, well, thank you for coming on. Sorry for being non-responsive over Discord. I promise you I do it to literally everyone. It's absolutely
no problem.
No preferential bias there. Yeah, so I have been informed by actually several people that you're here to base and Marx pill me. Which, I mean, I think I'm already pretty amenable to a lot of Marxist ideas, but you seem to have more of an economic focus than I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I take it that, I mean, I've watched some of your content. All the econ stuff I found on you, and feel free to correct me, is pertinent to market socialism, right? And that's kind of an umbrella term that is sort of broad. There are a lot of different systems that collectively you could call market socialist. So I think what would be easier in order to do the Marx pill thing, and I don't really want a debate, it doesn't have to be confrontational, but just as best you can, what do you take your economic prescriptions to be? Just in general.
I have been unconvinced by the history of planned economies, and it seems like right now in the world we live in, any country which deviates from commodity form, market economy type dealio suffers pretty severe consequences. Sometimes they're overt and malicious, like the CIA, and sometimes they're just a product of that system's inability to reconcile its nature with the other countries in the world. So I think that my general position is that we should attempt to, as aggressively as we can, achieve the political and sociological goals of socialism, while recognizing that at the moment many of its economic goals, like the abolition of the market economy, are more difficult to achieve and should perhaps be left for a time when the world's body politic is a little more amenable to that possibility. Maybe when the world is ready to move towards that direction, that would be an easier time to do it. But right now, it seems like it would just paint a huge target on the back of any country who took that position. It would make them vulnerable to foreign interventionism. It would make their markets fragile and easily fought against. And it would incentivize antagonism from countries with market economies because they would want to open you up to their labor exploitation. All of those things would lead to a lot of political instability, which would make it difficult to do all the other nice stuff. So that's my general position. And after we achieve that, I'm very, very open to the idea that we can do all sorts of PogChamp stuff with decommodification in a broader sense, not just like the post office and what have you.
Sure. So I think I mostly agree. I actually would describe myself as a market socialist for some of the same reasons, but I have specific reservations in the sense that it's often cited as some sort of transitionary phase, right? So command economies have serious problems, both in terms of how they've been executed in the past, as you know, and also in terms of there's conceptual stuff. There are conceptual problems like the economic calculation problem, the local knowledge problem. I don't know how much of that stuff you've read into, but the point is,
I know that they exist. I don't know that
right.
much about them, though.
Sure. So I guess like what's going to be interesting here is that Marx in Capital, Marx talks about, of course, the labor theory of value. And one of the things that the labor theory of value is specifically predicting or talking about is problems associated with profit extraction and profit accumulation.
Right.
Things like the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, et cetera, et cetera. And profit, in Marx's view, I'm sure you know this, is specifically the extraction of surplus labor value from workers. But I guess like what I'm interested in is, in your view, like, let's say we have a market socialist system. Let's say businesses are owned collectively by the working class. Let's additionally say we've, at this point, abolished the bourgeois, et cetera, et cetera. What exactly, one, do you conceive of when you talk about businesses operating in that sort of environment? And then two, how is that sort of like accumulation of, I guess we'll call it capital for brevity, significantly distinct from profit, such that it wouldn't be subject to the problems with profit that Marx talks about in those theories? And I can go into detail about those problems if you want me to.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the problems. I think it's kind of similar to the problems with a state, right? You know, states kind of suck. You know, the compulsion of violence being left in the hands of the state's agency and what have you. But I would rather a democratic state than an autocratic state. If you have a business, a firm, even a massive one, which is democratic in nature, I think this is a meaningful difference that gives people a lot more control over their environment. They're much more likely to be paid a fair wage, and I know that means a different thing in a Marxian sense than it does in like a conventional sense. But I think they're more likely to get more happiness out of the wage they're provided, and I think that it cuts down significantly on ennui as well, because they feel like they have a hand in the business, therefore have a reason to care about the portion of the day they spend at it. This is better. I don't think it fixes the problems, fundamentally. But it does put people in a position where they might be more willing to acknowledge those problems. After all, so long as it is the bourgeois that commands these businesses, stuff like, ennui and alienation and surplus labor, they're never even going to come up. But in a worker cooperative, especially in a society where worker cooperatives have been normalized, those would be kind of everyday conversations, I imagine, right? Ideally. Because people would have not only the exposure to these problems, but the power to do something about it.
So in this system, do you conceive of like business competition? Like, is your idea like, we have like two, I don't know, for simplicity, let's say like two bakeries, right? And they're each obviously producing baked goods that they then want to sell on a market. I take it you want to preserve the commodity form here, because that's generally what markets are reliant upon. Markets use commodities in terms of exchanges. So when these two bakeries go about engaging in these exchanges, right, and one bakery outcompetes the other bakery, typically in capitalism, as you know, that business would just like go defunct, right? It would cease to exist, and then those people would have to either find another way to compete, or they would just go find other jobs. I take it that's not something you want to preserve in market socialism. You don't want the sort of situation where like anything even remotely approaching a monopoly is possible to be created, right?
No, I mean, you would need very heavy state regulation of industry to prevent some of the more obvious problems with monopolies and planned obsolescence, environmental externalities, and other problems that just seem to be a thing that will always happen under those types of economies. Though in terms of competition, I think there are instances where the traditional capitalist motto of competition driving improvement is actually fairly defensible. There are certainly industries where the market is less destructive than in others. Take an industry like, say, for example, internet, ISPs, public transportation, hospitals. In these instances, competition does nothing for the consumer. Absolutely nothing. It's actively destructive. So these should be decommodified. Even in a capitalist government, they should be decommodified. But if you're talking, say, restaurants or arcades, it's more traditional consumer stuff, I think there are ways in which you can take advantage of the positives of capitalist competition. With a robust welfare state to help out the employees of any loser businesses, of course.
Yeah, so I guess like I'm just like I would personally just bite the bullet on this because I agree that it's a transitionary stage.
Mhm.
But I guess I'm not sure how you feel about this. It seems like the Marxist objection to this sort of system, what we're describing here, is just going to be that that sort of environment necessarily leads to unequal exchanges. And what I mean by it necessarily leads to unequal exchanges is the only instance in which the allocation of resources and labor could even remotely approach true equity seems to be under a command economy, which I have, conceptual issues with. So that necessitates a market, but unless you have something specific in mind, the very nature of a market, right? The idea of like producing something in a better way than another business is producing and then selling it on a market necessitates that there is going to be basically a class of people economically that are in a preferential position to another class of people, which maybe you just also bite the bullet and say, yeah, we probably need to preserve economic classes, unfortunately, as a transitionary step. But would you agree that like class distinctions are basically entailed there?
In the Marxian sense, no. If it's all worker cooperatives, they would all be members of the proletariat, no? There would certainly be people wealthier than one another. Differences in opportunity to, economic interest. But in terms of the Marxian sense, there would be only one class in this case, right?
Sure, but what prevents, like, take like an Amazon type thing. I know you're probably going to say we'll just regulate them to such an extent that they can't become this powerful, but you can conceive of a situation in a hypothetical market socialist economy where an Amazon type company becomes so essential to the operation of that economy and that society that significant regulation of them will significantly deteriorate people's quality of life. And then it becomes a question on the part of the government of like, well, we now have this company that is substantially wealthier than all the other companies. The workers in that company are, for all intents and purposes, like able to operate in a capitalistic capacity because of how much wealth they have accumulated. And now we're in a situation where what we were trying to avoid in the first place, which was, significantly unequal distribution of wealth, the problems associated with unregulated capitalistic competition, seem to just be reemerging, and regulating them out of existence would either require a revolution, which I'm not really on, that's not what I'm really advocating for, or we would basically have to bite the bullet and say, we need to regulate this company even if it means people suffer.
Yeah, well, you kind of preempted my answer, right? Ideally,
Sure.
no such thing should be allowed to take place in a market socialist society. If any such industry or business or what have you becomes that necessary for the functionality of the state, it should be incorporated into the state, decommodified, or broken up as needed. But I think that's a problem with any type of power structure, right? I mean, that goes beyond like a business. You could say the same thing about like in an anarcho-syndicalist society. You could say that about like a syndicate, or you could say that about like a given Politburo, or like a given like wing of the political party that votes on the distribution of resources across the broader collective. That's just a problem with power. You don't want power to be consolidated to a destructive extent. Hopefully that could be prevented.
Right, but what I'm getting at is that's the nature. And again, I actually agree with you more than people probably think. But the point is that's the crux, if you will, of the Marxist critique, right? The Marxist wants to say something like, if you say something like, oh, well, these problems are just in virtue of these hierarchies that exist, they're just going to respond to you by saying, well, why do you want to preserve the hierarchy? And if you say something like, I perceive it to be a necessary transitional stage to what I eventually want to accomplish, right? They're going to pull like the Marxist-Leninist card or just the Leninist card and say, what we ought do is immediately take the steps necessary to establish, say, like a dictatorship of the proletariat and a command economy. Now, I don't agree with those people, right? I think there are problems. I'm just saying, like, if they were to render that critique against you and say, why not just free ourselves of the chains, right? What exactly? And I think you've talked to. Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Well, my argument would be that that's not actually a set of chains you can really be freed from. If human need dictates the expansion of an industry to the point where the functionality of that industry is necessary to preserve people's quality of lives, you don't have a capitalism problem. You have an autocracy problem. And at that point, it really doesn't matter whether your economy is command or market. You're going to run into the same fundamental problem there. that there will be some person or some group of people who have, frankly, way too much power, way more than they need or deserve, and other agencies will have to kowtow to them. This happens in command economies. I mean, we've seen historically that even if you completely decommodify an industry, there have been examples of political battles being fought over the distribution of resources from like key industries, key factories, key provinces, how grain or boots or leather or what have you are distributed when there's not enough of it to go around, but everyone needs it. That seems to me, it's not that there's no relationship between this problem and capitalism, because there certainly is. It's more that I think that a solution can't just be to criticize the way market economies function. You have to look a little bit beyond that. Maybe some way of structuring a government to ensure there's no way economic power can be consolidated to that point. Or, I mean, hell, maybe you just have government regulations for worker cooperatives, which make them so deferential to the interests of their workers, so inherently democratic, that they're not even possible to wield, in a destructive way against the rest of the population. Is that even possible? I don't really know, but I'm no utopian. We do the best we can, right?
Right, so I'm about to sound like an asshole, and I promise I'm not most of the time, but it seems like one of the more common criticisms of people who advocate for these systems, yourself included, is that all of the things that are being discussed here, right? All of the prescriptions that are being made, both normative and political, right, are things that are achievable within the capitalist mode of production. So let me explain what I mean, right? What I mean is something like, basically it seems like if your goal is greater equity for workers, an improved quality of life for workers, greater worker ownership of means of production, though not necessarily worker ownership of those means in totality, greater worker influence in the state, the elimination of monopolistic control of the economy, etc., etc. All of these things are achievable within a system that is still ostensibly capitalistic. So let's take China, for instance, and I'm not a Dangist or a Tanky, just to be clear, but let's say China wasn't as like rigidly authoritarian as it was, just comparably, like a representative democracy, but still had like 60% state ownership of the economy, right? It seems like if you were to maintain that state ownership of the economy, or perhaps slightly increase it, while still maintaining an ostensibly capitalist system, all of the things that you're prescribing here are things that could be achieved, right? So like you could have all of these things that you're advocating for achieved within a hypothetical American economy that just placed a greater emphasis on state-operated enterprises while still maintaining a fundamentally capitalistic mode of production. And then in addition to that, the ability for people to, like, say, start their own businesses, the people to engage in capitalistic wage labor. Basically what I'm getting at, it doesn't seem that the objection is to private ownership of the means of production, right? It seems like the objection is just to the inability to properly regulate capitalism such that workers don't benefit in a meaningful way. Would you disagree with that?
No, I completely agree with you. The same thing could be said of monarchies, or the pharaohs. All the things that you're talking about right now, workers' rights, proper health care, freedom within business, etc., good regulation, high standard of living, could all be achieved with a single god king ruling over a country, or the world. But we wouldn't rely on the existence of that political order to bring us the objectives we want to achieve. Because, as it stands, a pharaoh, or a monarchy, these are not institutions very likely to give workers the rights we want them to have. And I think the same of capitalism. When I fight for socialism, worker control, proletarian state, etc., it's not because I fundamentally think that doing so will fix these problems. It's because I think it puts power in the hands of people more likely to fix those problems. So I would agree with you. It's technically possible to design a perfect society within capitalism. If you can tweak it just right and adjust all the economic and social parameters, you could make a society that I would consider as close to perfect as is possible. But you're fighting an uphill battle, because the people in charge of how capitalism is run is not the proletariat, bourgeois, and they don't have our interests. So with them in charge, sure, maybe we could have this perfect system, but we're building it, I don't know, we're building a ship in a bottle during an earthquake. Socialism gets rid of the earthquake. It doesn't build the ship in the bottle. but it makes sure the power structures that allow us to make positive changes are as secure as they can be.
Yeah, so then I think there's two objections that can be rendered then. The first is that if the idea is that socialism is more likely to facilitate, um, more likely to facilitate worker ownership of the means of production and all these prescriptions that you're providing, one could meaningfully respond to a statement like that by appealing to something like the Nordic model. And of course, obviously the Nordic model is not socialist, right?
Mhm.
But the point is, something like I think 40% of their workforce is unionized. They have state-owned enterprises, like we were talking about in the case of China. They have very effective collective bargaining systems, such that workers do have a substantial impact on both the economy and the government. And then it seems, as a consequence of that, the quality of life for workers in Nordic countries, particularly Norway, which has the most state ownership of those countries, is remarkably higher than the quality of life for workers in a quote-unquote cutthroat capitalistic state like the United States, right? And then the second problem, I guess, and this is something like a lib would probably render as a criticism, is just the sort of like things that you're talking about in terms of business regulation, preventing the emergence of monopolies and market socialism, retaining the commodity form, but somehow, ensuring that competition never leads to substantially unequal exchanges. They would probably argue that those sorts of things are not possible to attain or maintain absent highly authoritarian, highly hierarchical government regimes, right? So the Soviet Union, for instance, was a command economy for much of its existence under Stalin. But there was a time, particularly under the new economic plan, which Lenin advocated for, where they retained market exchanges, right? It's just they ensured that the market exchanges were not highly capitalistic. And the point is, the only way, obviously because of the nature of the Soviet Union, a historian could appeal to that and say something like, the only reason those exchanges, right, were things that could be substantially regulated and prevented from becoming unequal is in virtue of how authoritarian and how hierarchical the Soviet Union's government structure was. So I think those are the two biggest criticisms with what you're saying.
Of course. And to answer them respectively, I would say that most of the good that we see in the Nordic model is social democracy wrought by socialists. Socialists engaging in electoralism and political advocacy can't just snap their fingers and build socialism, tragically. But they can do what they will to make capitalism a little more bearable. And they've succeeded to a great extent in these Nordic models. But we are seeing here, I think, basically I'm going to kill myself if I can't hit the star. Roblox, Twitch, thank you.
Right, no, yeah, of course, in a video game.
Of course. We might be running up against the limits of what can reasonably be done with these Nordic models. How far can you go to make capitalism livable? There are also more fundamental existential questions here, right? What about alienation? Countries like Sweden, Norway, and what have you still have very high degrees of social alienation, loneliness, that I've read up quite a bit on. These are tied to capitalism, surely. Social democracy doesn't necessarily fix them. It also leads to a lot of inflexibility for the future. Maybe in a capitalist economy, we manage to construct a livable capitalist state. Fine. But material conditions change all the time. Technology, war, climate, catastrophe, political upsurgences, both within and without the country. Will a democratic socialist society, a social democrat society such as Norway, will it always be able to craft a livable environment for its workers in spite of its domination by the bourgeois? I don't believe so. And the fact that these countries, these Nordic countries, are in the minority here, that most capitalist countries are quite a bit more dystopic to live in, suggests to me that this isn't really a working model for how to craft the livable state. And to the second argument you made, I don't think a government would need to be very authoritarian for business regulations to prevent corporations from getting too monopolistic. A lot of what I'm advocating for with business regulations is already present in these aforementioned Nordic countries. Anti-monopolization laws, ensuring that, oh my god, this level. Ensuring that corporations have, say, internal regulations they have to adhere to with the democratization of their industry. I think these things are doable without without authoritarianism. It wouldn't be worthwhile to do them if they couldn't be done without authoritarianism. The goal here is to fight authoritarianism, the autocracy of the traditional firm. So if we ended up fighting that by instituting an autocratic state, it seems like we've missed the point a little bit, you know?
Right, sure. And I'll quickly address the Nordic model thing and then move into what I think the broader point is here. So I agree that, like, as with all capitalistic countries, loneliness in the Nordic countries is high. I think it's actually remarkably high, like you pointed out. But I guess I would need, like, a reason to think that that sort of loneliness and social isolation is reducible to Marx's theory of alienation specifically. So, like, I think in the United States, which is a more, like, rigidly capitalistic country, more cutthroat, if you will, it's fair to say that a good deal of social problems and social alienation originates from issues related to class, like labor exploitation, alienation from commodities, that sort of stuff. But if basic needs, by and large, are met in a country like, say, Norway, and there's collective bargaining and there's relatively high wages comparable to the rest of the world, then the argument that the social problems in that country just reduced to worker alienation becomes much more difficult to substantiate, because there's a variety of things that could be attributing to that sort of social isolation. It's basically like there's going to have to be an argument for why that hypothesis is most explanatory. So one could say something like cultural influences, the history of the country, have attributed to that. You could say something like technology, which obviously I don't take you to be like an anprim or something. Technology itself is alienating, right? Stuff like that could be just as explanatory as appealing to a Marxist theory of alienation. So I guess I'm not really sold on that. And as for the broader point, and I'll try to, like, tie it back to what we were talking about at the beginning here, I think the fundamental point is, like, Marx's critiques towards markets and the capitalist profit motive seem to persevere under market socialism. It just seems to be that profit is replaced by some other form of capital accumulation, but the systemic problems that he thinks, for instance, lead to the tendency for the rate of profit to fall are still emergent in market socialism just in virtue of capital accumulation itself. And then further, you mentioned that you're like, your ultimate goal is to eliminate authoritarianism, eradicate, like, authoritarianism, have power vested in workers. And it seems like you've already conceded, of course, that market socialism, in your view, is transitionary, but it sounds like what you're really advocating for, correct me if I'm mistaken, is like a form of anarchism. Like, your ideal sort of society, which I guess you could just say is communism as Marx understood it, but your ideal sort of society is just one where all of these unjustified hierarchies that we've been talking about over the last hour or so, that we just view as, like, necessary evils in order to retain a coherent economic or political system, you just view as things in the long term that ought to be abolished. Am I on the right track there, or would you not agree with that take?
I am extremely sympathetic to anarchist arguments. I just don't I can't believe this level. The reason why I don't talk that much about anarchism directly that much anymore is because these days I'm more of the opinion that by the time we achieve a society capable of even moving towards anarchism or communism, the material conditions by which people live are going to be so alien to what I know today that I can't make political prescriptions for them. So, like, the world we live in today is unimaginable to Marx. He could not have fathomed it. If Marx were dug up and resuscitated and brought to the world today, he would instantly have a stroke. It's incomprehensible.
Absolutely, yeah. He would fucking lose his mind. Yeah.
Yeah, instantly. He would be incoherent.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the same will be the case the world 100 years from now. The rate of technological and social progression is accelerating rapidly. And it makes me think that today, what I consider an unjustified hierarchy, what I consider a necessary sacrifice, what I consider X, what I consider Y, maybe 50, 100 years from now, all of these considerations will be laughable to the people of the future. Or to the me of the future, you know? So I try not to talk about them that much.
Right.
I try to talk about solutions that I think are workable now. Problems that I know will still be problems in the future, if not addressed between now and then. And because I am a big fan of democracy, pretty much on principle, I know that I want society to be controlled by power structures which privilege the greatest number of people possible, which hence market socialism, proletariat over bourgeois. You spoke of a couple things. First, can I attribute the problems in Norway, Sweden, what have you, exclusively to Marxian alienation? I cannot, no. And it may well be the case that many of the problems which I believe would be solved by market socialism, or by full socialism, communism, would still exist in these societies due to cultural reasons or whatever. The only answer I really have to that is either A, give me more time to research, or B, let's try it and find out. I mean, after all, if you take a look at the writings of the Enlightenment thinkers, there were many problems they thought would be solved by democracy that clearly haven't been. But we've still benefited from the experiment, no? The move away from the monarchies, I mean, a lot of them thought that we would live in, like, an enlightened age of, like, collective, democratic participation in society where everyone would go down to the local town hall and debate the issues of the day. This is not the society we live in, but it's still preferable to the one that those Enlightenment thinkers lived in. So maybe it's just about the movement, not about the goal you're moving towards. I don't know which problems are going to be solved for sure, but I'm relatively confident in the political prescriptions I'm comfortable making. I.e., worker cooperatives seem to be effective, functional, efficient, and they produce a lot of happiness. And that, fundamentally, our country prioritizes democracy. Why would we not extend that to the economy? And if we can accept those precepts, then maybe we can feel comfortable moving forward.
Yeah, so I think you and I just basically agree insofar as market socialism is going to require some necessary evils. Yeah, this game that you're playing seems absolutely like
watch the stream.
Unbelievably. Okay. Yeah, I think market socialism is just one of these necessary evil type things. There's a funny quote by Deng Xiaoping of CCP fame, and again, not a tanky, I promise, but it's just a hilarious quote. He says something like, we don't know what socialism is or how to get there, but we're still moving towards it. And I'm not saying that's representative of your position. I just think I agree that if you just have this like broad paintbrush stroke of socialism as, say, worker ownership of means of production, it's not actually necessary to talk with a high degree of specificity about what exactly is constitutive of that system. You can just, within the current system, within what what I guess tankies would call bourgeois democracy, right? Advocate for policies that you think will dramatically improve worker quality of life and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I just want to say, there's basically never been a gigantic social, political, or economic paradigm shift that was perfectly planned out prior to its implementation. There's usually just a bunch of, crazy historical shit happens for a while, and then once the pieces are more or less settled, people start being a little bit smarter with how they refine what's left. But the transition to democracy, away from feudalism, from empires over to nation-states, from the Grecian city-states over to empires, nobody sat down and was like, okay, here's how we're doing this, buddy. Here are the social problems that'll be fixed by that, that kind of stuff. That just doesn't happen.
It's not like a bunch, right? It's not like a bunch of people in feudalism got together one morning and were just like, hey, let's plan out capitalism. It didn't work that way, and I think that's the defensible part of Marxism that I think presumably you agree with. It's not so much about, let's draft up a blueprint with unbelievable specificity about exactly what's going to be constitutive of this economic system. It's more so something like there are these historical materialist forces that resulted in, say, capitalism emerging from feudalism, and socialism is something that inevitably, just inexorably, right, is going to emerge from the capitalist mode of production. But
well, that's the hope.
That said, the hope, of course. But in saying that, I guess, like, again, the problem is just going to be something like, if the movement from capitalism to, say, socialism, for instance, is not a move away from things that are central to capitalism, things like profit extraction, capital accumulation, market exchanges, all things that I advocate for different reasons, a more orthodox Marxist, for instance, could look at this and say, well, if you're advocating for this eventual materialist transition away from the capitalist mode of production, if you think what ought happen for mankind is that we move towards something like socialism, then why advocate for a system that retains some of the things that almost everybody in this field would concede are problems with the current system, won't that just delay or otherwise suppress the eventual transition to quote unquote real socialism? That's consistently the like orthodox Marxist response to these sorts of talking points. And insofar as like just read theory bro types are concerned, they're technically correct about that. You can like, and this is what I do, you can object to points in Marxist theory. You can like have arguments about whether or not, like you said earlier, Marx's conception of society is even accurate anymore given technological innovation and the difference in social forces now versus the 1800s. But the point is, they're just going to respond to you and say, look, what you're advocating for is moving away from what people actually want to move forward relative to Marx's conceptions, right? You're advocating for like red capitalism. That seems to consistently be the critique.
Well, I mean, so there are 2 points to that. First of all, could you, just so I making sure that I've got my shirt buttoned up properly, would you mind telling me what the definition of a proletarian state is?
Yeah, so I take it that a proletarian state is just going to be like a socialist, you know, quote unquote socialist state in which all political and economic power is vested in the working class. And I think that necessitates the abolishment of the bourgeois specifically, right?
Right. This is the thing I care about first and foremost, yes? The abolishment of the bourgeois. Yeah. This is done through market socialism. You set the stage, right? People considered the proletarian state, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, a necessary precondition for the establishment of full socialism, because first you need to make sure the right people have their hands on the reins, and that allows you to then move forward with the more radical and transformative goals. Everything, fundamentally, is transitionary. There is no end point in a totality. You're always transitioning towards something else, hopefully something better. The other argument that I would make, frankly, is that I'm always open to better solutions, but the type of people who criticize market socialism for delaying the transition to real socialism are also the types of people who believe that China is moving towards socialism. I've seen the types of societies these people believe are moving towards socialism, and I am not convinced by the preferability of their solution.
Right. Yeah. Let me just be clear on one thing. Under no circumstances am I saying like any of these 20th century so-called socialist states are good, right? I am like anything but a tanky. I think they're all oppressive, morally reprehensible authoritarian regimes, right? But in saying that, I think there's an additional criticism that can be levied where obviously at the time, per their own statements and their theories, right, these were perceived as also transitionary states, right? Lenin, for instance, viewed the October Revolution and then the establishment of the Soviet Union to be a transitionary stage towards establishing socialism. He says as much constantly, and even conceded that the Soviet Union, obviously before he died, was not a socialist society. It was still moving towards socialism. And what do we see in the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Cuba, right? We see one of two things, both of which are regressive if your actual goal is the establishment of socialism, right? You see either regression into state capitalism, as with China, where market reforms eventually take over and they just become a nominally capitalist country.
Right.
Or you see what Trotsky called degenerated worker states, where they're not exactly like market societies, but there is a class of people who are functionally just a bourgeois class who basically control workers and are highly totalitarian and highly authoritarian. Yeah, so what I'm getting at, and this is the broader point. What I'm getting at is like, what reason do you have to think, I guess, market socialism would not constitute the same sort of regressive society? Like, do you think retaining some elements of capitalistic markets and market exchanges and such could lead to the same sort of regression we saw in the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, etc.?
No, because I think I can say with objective confidence that market socialism is more democratic than the society we have today. The societies they all proposed were not more democratic than what we have today. The systems they advocated for, their transitionary systems, the Marxist-Leninists, the Maoists, the what have you, their transitionary systems always entailed some sort of reigning authoritarian body guiding the proletariat of their country towards a desirable outcome. Since democracy is ultimately what this should all be about, I mean, that was what Marx wrote about, after all. I've read enough Marx to know this, at least. Marx didn't write, about everyone being equal, or about, like, the vanguard party shepherding the working class over, etc., etc. No. Marx wrote about freedom. And ultimately, all of his political prescriptions were in aid of the goal of promoting the freedom of the working class. So, if your way of doing this is what, through Dengism? What, through Soviet-style, what these people do? No, I think it's ridiculous.
Those things are bad, for sure, right?
Right.
But I'm saying,
do
if
no
I were
harm,
if I were...
right? At least
Right,
the system
exactly.
I advocate for, a positive step. Will it prolong market economies? Well, it won't if you can't provide a better and faster solution to abolishing them. And so far, I haven't seen one done, so... I think a lot of people just like being Puritans, frankly. They like obsessing over this. They don't really want communism or socialism or what have you. A lot of them are just... Well, there are two groups, I think. They're either people who are well off in Western countries, for whom socialism is purely an aesthetic exercise, a virtue signal, essentially. Even if they believe it, it's mostly about how well can they pose as one. It might as well be a costume. And there are also a lot of people who are essentially doomers. They're communists and socialists, not purely for the political prescriptions they entail, but also because they have this deep-seated belief that there's no way to affect positive change within the system that exists now, so they might as well adopt a political ideology that gives them an excuse for holding off, which I think is unproductive. If people think market socialism will delay addressing the problems with capitalism, then I'm all for it. But the people who make those criticisms are the same types of people who say that we need a global revolution now to prevent climate change. Or that, the proletariat in America need to rise up, today to overthrow. These people are delusional. They have no understanding of the systems that they're criticizing, much less of political efficacy. Maybe I'm consumed too much by political efficacy. Maybe that's why I care about these issues and speak for them the way that I do. But I would much rather be cautiously in favor of something that I know will work than recklessly in favor of something which I know won't.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think all of that is perfectly fine. And what I would say in conjunction with that is something like, I think there's an important balance to strike in the pursuit of something like market socialism or greater equity for workers, because you can operate within the current system and engage in legislative practices and push reforms that improve quality of life for workers with the ultimate long-term goal of workers owning the means of production with the retention of a market system, right? I think that's fine. But, and I think you'll just agree with me here, most likely, one needs to be exceptionally careful in doing that, not to engage in what I'll call bourgeois apologism or bourgeois regression. And what I mean by that is obviously, because both economic systems in question here are fundamentally market systems, right? Market socialism has a market, capitalism has a market. There's a substantive difference in advocating for things that promote market socialism and promote worker equity, and advocating for policies that may prima facie seem to be socialist or seem to be pro-worker, but in actuality just allow the bourgeois to retain power in another form, or perhaps more subtly retain power.
This would be my criticism of China, though, right? With
right.
the CCP and the billionaires with direct control over the...
Absolutely. I think that's the problem. That's the main issue with China, right? I think they largely use Marxism and Maoism and all these, revolutionary ideologies just as a smokescreen for what is actually happening, which is tight, rigid authoritarian control of the economy that props up, obviously, both the CCP and a functionally bourgeois class. And that's the exact kind of regression I'm talking about, right? Because China likes to call itself a socialist market economy, right? And whatever that's supposed to even mean in China's context. But the point is, China, and this is what we're trying to avoid with the establishment of market socialism, China basically has its cake and gets to eat it too, because they can push forward for some sort of legislative reform and say, hey guys, I'm Xi Jinping. I'm advocating for the establishment of Maoism. I'm moving towards the great new utopia. But in actuality, what Xi Jinping is doing is just propping up state capitalism, right? State-controlled businesses that compete on the international market and are just nominally capitalist enterprises. Do you get what I'm saying?
Of course. Well, I mean, the obvious retort that I would make, essentially, is that if anyone criticizing me for the potential for, preserving the power of the bourgeois in just another form, if anyone is criticizing me for that point, then they had better never have said the words existing socialism at any point in any defense of any existing state. Because You can take a look, whether you're looking at Vietnam, China, the Soviet Union, or what have you, it seems like pretty much every pre-existing socialist project has worked to preserve the power of like an autocratic group with a different set of class interests than the proletariat. Again, I'm amenable to better solutions. It's just so much of this discourse has had in bad faith. I swear most of the socialists that I argue with online over this seem to have, like, an elementary schooler's understanding of political advocacy. Like,
Yeah, I hope you don't take it that I'm coming off.
No. You're testing me. You're not advocating for this. But many of the people who push for this, it's like it's almost offensive to me, because many of the the socialist writers we so envy, were quite pragmatic in the advocacy of the positions they hold, very much so actually, and they were very thoughtful too. I mean, hell, even Marx said that with countries like America, it may be possible to achieve socialism through bourgeois electoralism. If you say that, like, on most socialist boards here today, now, they'll call you a lib for it. It's from the horse's mouth, baby. But they don't care. It just doesn't look socialist to them. It's like, the aesthetic isn't ideal, so they reject it. It's all very silly.
Yeah, I mean, I would be inclined to agree there. I think just to, like, wrap things up, because I think we've gotten to the crux of the issue. There's merit in describing oneself as a market socialist, but beyond a broad economic qualifier like that, a broad economic tent, if you will, you need to be exceptionally cautious in what policies you're specifically advocating for, because we have examples of two things, right? We have examples, and obviously, I don't think any fucking 20th century state that has called itself socialist is actually socialist, right? That's a crock of shit, frankly. But the establishment of these 20th century quote-unquote socialist regimes have lended themselves to one of two things. They've either lended themselves to what Trotsky called deformed or degenerated worker states, where obviously, there's a functionally bourgeois party that is just the political class, and the workers get screwed over, and it's an authoritarian, totalitarian regime, very divorced from what Marx had in mind when he was discussing socialism, right? And then the other potential outcome for 20th century socialist regimes has been state capitalism, right? Market reforms that have just resulted in a China-type situation that I don't know how anybody in their right mind would qualify modern China as a socialist country. It's just one of the most obnoxious things in leftist discourse. But the point is, like, I think, and maybe this is a lib take you'll disagree with, in the interim, right, within the capitalist mode of production, in terms of advocating for greater worker equity and greater rights for workers, right? Mm-hmm. You can just say something like, we should move towards something like a social democracy, or just like quote unquote better capitalism, and that will provide workers with political capital necessary to then advocate for the establishment of something like market socialism, or even a further type of socialism, right? You don't need to do something like, say, let's raise the minimum wage. I think a lot of those policies are just like basically retaining bourgeois power at the end of the day. There needs to be, and maybe you'll disagree with this, there needs to, the sorts of policies that socialists should be advocating for are things that represent a fundamental change in the modus operandi of the government, right? Something like a UBI, right? As an example, right? A UBI provides workers with breathing room and political capital such that now, instead of like struggling to feed themselves, they can engage in the sort of political advocacy that would be necessary for long-term establishment of socialism. I don't know what your thoughts are on UBI, but the point I'm just making is that we should exercise caution in the specific policies and political programs that we're advocating for, even if we want to be pragmatic and reformist a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think that even if you're a full-blown communist, I think that you should be able to agree with social democrats like Sam Cedar types on pretty much 99% of issues, you know? A lot of social democrats are amenable to socialist ideas. They're just... Society isn't in a place where they feel like solutions that radical are necessary, you know? For example, like, if you live in a kind of a rickety house that's on fire, people care most about putting out the fire. And if you're like, okay, sure, the fire should be put out, but after that's done, you know, we could really do with, like, reconstructing the floorboards to make it a little more stable, they'll look at you like you're a lunatic. You know, the house is on fire. So... It's about setting people up for to be disappointed in the right ways. It's one of the reasons why I'm very adamant about the importance of making sure Democrats are in power. As long as Republicans are in power, social democrats and even progressive liberals are never going to care about more substantive critiques of the system because there's such an obvious off-the-cuff solution to so many of them. Defeat the Republicans. They're lunatics, the Republicans. Like, that's obvious. Why would you, like, what?
Right.
If Donald Trump is in office if God King Trump for his, like, 5th term, why would you ever care to argue about, why would you ever care to argue about, like, the fundamental reform of the relationship between the workers and the business? Like, it's abstract, you know? So what you do, as a good lefty, in my humble opinion, and people, I mean, they don't like this, whatever, what I think you should do is you should try to stay, you know, a little bit humble. Relate to the problems that people have on their own terms. Don't freak out at people and try to hit them with some crazy economic Marxian theory. Agree on the solutions that are obvious, but when you can, try to sell them on a more substantive solution. When people are talking about unions, say, hey, unions are great. I agree. They raise wages. But isn't it kind of interesting that what we're fighting for right now is for there to be a separate, smaller institution within a business that gives us the power to fight back against overreaches of the business's power? Wouldn't it make a little bit more sense if the business just didn't have the power over us to begin with? Little stuff like that. And you can sell them on the more institutional critiques, as long as you're willing to hear them out on the more, I don't know, I don't want to say trivial, the more standard ones. This is what I believe, and I think you can convince many people this way.
Sure. Do you? So I guess a follow-up question to that would be something like, while I agree Republicans suck, they're very bad people. No offense to any Republicans in the audience, you know.
Yes, no offense.
Although I mean it's a Vosh stream, so you know, kind of out of place. No offense. The point is, like, why do you think, like, political capital and political effort is better invested in, say, propping up Biden, right, or propping up AOC, or propping up Bernie Sanders, or like any of these people, right, that you and I are obviously going to agree are immensely preferable to Republican politicians and Republican candidates? Or do you think that political capital and our time is better invested in the establishment and promotion of quote-unquote workers' parties, even ones that are not nominally socialist? So something like a market socialist political party, right? Obviously, it's a third party. We operate in a two-party bipartisan system. It's very hard for third parties to gain meaningful political capital. But it seems like with sufficient effort, I mean, unless you think it's just logically impossible for a worker party to gain that level of prominence, it's basically one of two options, right? A, do you think, like, it's just a false dichotomy and one can advocate for the promotion of a workers' party while still advocating for, like, you know, AOC over some Republican contender for her seat? Or two, do you think it is dichotomous and it's just a waste of time to promote workers' parties, and given that we should engage in the promotion of, like, leftist Democratic candidates within the Democratic Party? Because I take the latter, right? I would advocate for both. I take the latter, where you just say, well, there's not much we can do with respect to third parties. We should just primarily focus on AOC, Bernie, you know, squad types. I take that to almost be political defeatism, because it seems to suggest that within the confines of the American political apparatus, all that will ever be possible is the Dems or the Republicans. And I don't know if you would agree with a statement like that.
As long as we still have first past the post, I would agree with that statement, yeah. As long as the voting system is as it is right now, it's that, the Democrats and the Republicans. Of course, it doesn't always have to be that way. And the Democrats are more likely to reform our voting system than the Republicans are, pretty significantly, though not as much as it needs to be. And when that happens, I think it becomes less dichotomous. Even if we did have a viable, like, market socialist party, I would probably advocate to just participate in, like, the Democratic primaries to prefer progressive candidates, and also vote for the, you know, the market socialist party in the general election, assuming it's not first past the post and we're not dealing with Republicans being sort of the forebear there. The presence of fascism, or of the far right, is kind of like the bludgeoning stick that the Democrats use to get away with remaining moderates. as long as there's the threat that progressivism can be unpopular and thus lead to a Republican victory, it's easier for them to get away with moderation. So we must deny them that excuse by ensuring that Republicans are electorally unviable. And then maybe it's the moderate Dems versus the progressive Dems. And then you have to do the exact same thing all over again, right? Except this time with the moderate Dems. And then maybe it is with the progressive Dems and the market socialists, right? And so on and so on. That's the dream, at least. How possible that is really depends on how effectively we can sell our message. And I think that it becomes easier to sell our message the more ideologies adjacent to ours are normalized. Like Bernie Sanders. Did Bernie Sanders call for, the elimination of all private industry? No, but I bet you there are a hell of a lot more communists in America because of him. So...
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Take advantage of, the discourse when possible. And, I guess just be aware that we're probably, at least right now, not living in revolutionary conditions. I know that's frustrating to some people, because it's like, oh my god, George Floyd, BLM, the housing crisis. We're not in revolutionary conditions right now. Americans are not willing to go out there and fight and die to secure a better life at the moment. That's just not... People just aren't at that state at the moment. So chill out for a sec and meet people where they're at. Maybe it takes a while to get to a better world, but shit, I mean, at least we stay on the right road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree that, like, obviously the conditions necessary for a revolution don't exist currently, and I think, like, advocating for a revolution is actually damaging to the broader leftist movement, primarily because, like, and I'm sure, I think you've said this before, so you'll just probably agree. If I were to approach, like, a construction worker, right, who obviously he's a member of the working class, I want him to be a leftist, and I start talking about things like an armed insurrection against the government, he's just, one of two things is going to happen. Either his brain is going to turn off, or he's going to report me to the authorities, neither of which are very conducive to moving him to the left, right? So I agree that, like, the tactics that are typically engaged by, we'll say, the less extreme elements of the left are certainly preferable to the tactics that are advocated for by Marxist-Leninists and tankies. But
yeah, who gets convinced by those guys? Seriously, who gets moved to leftism for this? Maybe 14-year-olds. I imagine the rhetoric is very compelling to people who like being edgy. But this, like, gulag, gut the rich, etc., I would be willing to bet far more people are moved to the left by the calm and passive delivery of social democratic reform arguments than they ever could be by, like, Soviet LARPing. And maybe that says a lot about where we are right now, but...
Right, I actually think it's kind of like a psychological thing. So tell me what you think of this, because I've been mulling over this for a while. I almost feel like, this is not to call people stupid or anything, but nuanced discussions of political policy, in-depth conversations about how political systems function, these sorts of things, right, are a lot more complex and a lot more, we'll say, difficult to digest than something like burn it all down, blow it up. And what I mean by that is, like, if you have some sort of angst against the system, if you've been exploited under capitalism, which of course many people have, myself included. I'm from a poor background myself, I get it, right? But it seems like almost politically lazy in a lot of instances to just then say something like, well, rather than, like, figuring out the mechanisms of how the system functions, rather than talking about policy, rather than promoting things within the political apparatus that I think will immediately benefit both my life and the lives of those in a similar economic station, it's much easier and less mentally taxing to just say, it's time to blow it up, it's time to burn it down, it's time for, like, eat the rich type rhetoric, right? It almost strikes me as like lazy. I don't know how else to put it, right?
Well, it's certainly like, easier than the alternative, right? Giving, like, the... so, not to jerk myself off, but I do think about the things that I believe in a lot. It's my job to. If I didn't, then, I would get epically owned in online debates more than I already do, I guess. And the arguments that I make, like, none of this is, like, fun, I don't get some great, euphoria out of promoting, say, Biden over Trump, or for saying that
Right.
we're probably not going to see a socialist society in our lifetime, or for saying
Yeah,
that,
you're not a CIA agent, despite the accusations.
yeah, you know, as fun as that would be, and as well as that would pay, I'm not a CIA agent. So, like, this isn't all about catharsis for me, but the burn it all down, eat the rich type stuff, that can be very cathartic. You take a look at, like, a lot of these, very silly people in the online left. I can tell they're having a tremendous amount of fun with the political prescriptions they're making. God bless them. But I don't think they lead people down the right road. Even if you're radicalized by that type of rhetoric, are you being radicalized in a direction that, that actually promotes good? That makes you politically efficacious? That enriches you and enriches your community? That makes you a good and productive political agent? I don't know. I don't think so. It seems like it does the opposite. It makes you a doomer. It makes you nihilistic. It makes you unwilling to engage in the system because nothing's good enough, you know? Why bother with engaging in the nuances of the system as it exists when the system as it exists is cringe, and not even revolutionary or based or red-pilled? Why not wait for that revolution? Why not just sit there forever?
Yeah, and the other consideration, and I don't mean to sound like a PragerU correspondent, but the other consideration is that while obviously socialism as a broad political spectrum has been strawmanned to fucking death in the liberal media, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's truth. There's some degree of truth to the claim that, like, every attempt at like a Marxist-Leninist or Leninist type regime or a Maoist type regime, including, of course, China itself, the Soviet Union, Cambodia, right? A lot of people died, and a good majority of the people that were killed in those political revolutions were not what Marx would call or Engels would call the bourgeois, right? Take China, right? Obviously, the tanky apologetic here is to just say, well, it was a consequence of them trying to industrialize rapidly. But the point is, like, does that really excuse the fact that millions of Chinese people died as a consequence of a famine that was obviously exacerbated by the policies of the Chinese Communist Party? And
really stupid policy, too. Every farmer produce pig iron in your backyard, stop producing grain. Like, this is some delusional shit. Like, this is some, like, second grader playing Civ 6 type shit, you know?
Well, and in addition to that, I know you've talked to Hakim before. He said something like, well, one of the failures of 20th century socialism was the intention that socialist states, particularly the USSR, had of competing with the West, right? Competing with the capitalist hegemonic system globally, right? And that's the reason why they tried to industrialize so rapidly, and as a consequence of that ultra rapid industrialization, so many people fucking died. But the point is, like, if you advocate for that type of system, if you advocate for a revolution within capitalist hegemony, it seems like there's good inductive reason to think that any regime of that nature is just going to, again, try to compete with hegemonic capitalist control because they kind of have to in order to not get invaded, right? And that, as a consequence, is going to result in millions upon millions of people starving to death or being executed or being sent to political prisons. So if that's the case, not to sound like a defeatist, but if that's the case, then it seems like the thing that should be done is what Marx and Engels called gradualism. What we should do is very, very, very slowly wither away the capitalist mode of production through a nominally pro-worker reforms and politics, and eventually we'll get to the day where we can establish a socialist system without having to engage in that sort of competition, and as a consequence, millions of people don't die unnecessarily. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, you have to do this shit well, or there's no point in doing it at all. Christ, can you imagine if our our Enlightenment forefathers had been anywhere near as myopic as so many of these LARPy socialists online? Oh yeah, we're gonna do democracy, and what we're gonna do in order to achieve that is we're just going to have individual villages across the Kingdom of England, you know, declare secession and say they are now a democratic republic, and like, I don't know, they'll just like take it from there, I guess. And like, any attempt to barter with the aristocracy or bide for time is counter-revolutionary or some shit. Like, no.
Right.
There actually were early attempts at democracies that failed after the Enlightenment specifically because they didn't make the necessary provisions. They didn't take the time. They didn't put the thought necessary into doing this right. And I don't know, that just seems kind of pathetic to me. I mean, if we really do have the right idea on this, then shouldn't it be easy for us to make the argument that we need to take the time to make sure it's done right?
Right. Yeah. I think you and I just agree on that point, then. I think even if you're a revolutionary, whatever that's supposed to mean anymore, the point is, like, presumably you would still concede that the conditions necessary for a successful seizure of the means of production just don't exist right now. And if you try to seize the means of production within the current capitalist hegemony, you're either just going to get crushed, right, by, like, the imperialist West, as people call it, right?
Right.
Or if you succeed and you actually manage to establish a nominally socialist government, you're just going to get millions of people killed as a consequence of trying to compete with that imperialistic West, right? So no matter how you slice it, right, either way, advocating for revolution right now is not only, like, politically impotent, you're not really, like, helping workers in the short term, you're also very likely advocating for something that is detrimental to the goals of workers, because outside of the deaths, right, when these socialist regimes collapse, it's a field day for people in the West, right? What happened when the Soviet Union collapsed? Every, like, American journalist and media correspondent just immediately started jacking off and kept jacking off for, like, years. To
this day, they're still jacking off, yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I think we just agree. Like, there is not considerable merit in, at least right now, advocating for a revolution, right? It just seems like wildly antithetical to the long-term goals of workers and the quality of life for members of the working class. So, yeah, I agree there.
Well, I'm happy to see that we agree on most of this. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but
right.
It seems that we're both right. I appreciate you coming on, by the way.
For sure. If you ever want to have another conversation, like, obviously we're at it on Discord, so just shoot me a message and I'm happy to.
Yeah. Can you shout out all your socials?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm New American Left Guy thing. On Twitter, I'm New Left Press, all one word, obviously. On YouTube, I'm New American Left. It's probably preferable to follow me on Twitter, because that's where I give, like, my spicy takes more often. The stuff on YouTube is, like, more video essay type stuff. I really enjoyed the conversation, Voss. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was a tremendous pleasure. Hopefully it was the profound intellectuality of this conversation that is making me so bad at this video game right now. Hopefully that gets a little better. Anyway, thank you again, and have a wonderful night.
You too. See ya.
See ya.